Well, Nicole and Allison, you have been such a great partner to WIA, and we could not be here without all the work that you guys have been doing at BRIC. So congratulations, and this is amazing that we're back in person. So thrilled to be here. So my name is Jinko Goto, and I'm Vice President of Women in Animation. And you know, we've come a long ways, and it is because of everybody in this room. Back in 2015, we said we wanted gender parity by 2025. We started with the union numbers right around 20%, and we're at 34%. So we still have work to do, but again, to all of you guys, we are going to get there. In the program, we are starting a Creative Leadership Institute, especially to really help middle management and middle leadership, because what we're seeing is that there's obviously leadership within institutions at the senior level, like Karen and others, but what we're lacking is really middle leadership. And what we need to do is really, if we want to make a change, we really need to see more leadership that represent diversity. So in the program, there is a page about our WIA Creative Leadership Institute. If you're interested, please reach out to us. So with that, we are going to be talking today about intro change the narrative. And the description about this panel is, how do we recession-proof diversity? Let's move diversity from altruism to business critical. So for moderator, we have Alex Sherman, who covers media, entertainment, and telecommunication for CNBC. He joined CNBC in January 2018 after almost 10 years at Bloomberg, where he worked as an M&A reporter and a media reporter. Alex frequently appears on TV and was the host of Bloomberg's Deal of the Week podcast. He graduated from Harvard in 2004 and has 2 master's degrees, an MS in journalism from Northwestern and an MBA from NYU Stern. He's originally from Lexington, Massachusetts, and currently lives in Princeton, New Jersey, with his wife and 3 children. Welcome. Thank you so much.
So first, I just wanted to thank BRIC for having me moderate this panel, because when I think of the ideal vision of underrepresentation in Hollywood, it is a straight, white, Jewish male who graduated from Harvard. So I appreciate that. But you know, it's like, you know, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. Speaking of which, I thought the first thing we could do is identify the problem here, because there are many hurdles toward advancing representation in Hollywood. And I wanted to just give each of you on the panel, maybe you can sort of introduce yourself and say who you are and where you're coming from first. But after that, maybe just give one thought in terms of, as you think about this issue and advancing representation on screen, what is the biggest current hindrance to that goal? We can start with you, Riaz.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Riaz Hamarani. I'm the Vice President of Global Analytics at Paramount Pictures. I think coming from a data perspective, I think the biggest problem is that there's a miscommunication in the information that a lot of our executive leadership is being given. As important as storytelling is, data storytelling is a big part of this equation as well. I think as that information starts to become more and more clear, the question of how do we recession-proof diversity will go away. And that's my hope, is that we can use all the information, all the performance results at our disposal to essentially, again, make that question no longer relevant.
Hi, I'm Dana Theobald. I'm a DEI consultant. I was previously in DEI at Warner Brothers Discovery, and before that, I worked for many years in development and current series and animation at Cartoon Network, at Marvel Animation, at NBC Universal for a minute. So hi, hello. I'm also disabled. This is my leg. Say hi. I think the biggest problem is even this idea that there's diverse content and then there's mainstream content. I think that's going away, fortunately, but I think when we talk about making the business case for diversity, it's still, for some reason, there's this bias in our heads where we think of diverse content as being smaller, maybe less budget, when it's not, and it also doesn't have to be. So that's I think is the problem, is we just need to start thinking about it as content and what are the opportunities in all of our content.
Hi, everyone. My name is Safiya Noble. I'm a professor of gender studies and African American studies at UCLA, and my research is focused with algorithmic discrimination on the internet, racist and sexist AI, for example. And this is an interesting conversation because I'm not a part of Hollywood, but I certainly feel like there are outside of Hollywood constraints upon the industry. And by that I mean I'm old enough here to have remembered these similar kinds of conversations in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so it's really bizarre to still be having them in the 2020s. And I think part of what we're dealing with is a world of escalating global inequality. We are living in a time of a profound rollback of civil and human rights around the world, and including in the United States. We see that even most recently with the rollback of Roe. And I think those are part of the conditions also that we have to think about when we think about what Hollywood's role is in the world. And I'm not sure that people who work inside the industry are always thinking about these other broader sets of concerns, like families being politically broken apart by social media, or the kind of fraught political conditions and environment that we live in. Of course, we live in a city that is profoundly marked by inequality, most certainly. And so there's a role for us to think about kind of pulling back too, and not just thinking about how do we predict what is most profitable, but also what is our role as creators and makers and business people in making the worlds we want. And I think those are really fascinating and interesting and important conversations that take us a little bit out of the weeds of hiring practices and metrics and kind of what our DEI measures and our EEOC measures are, which are also incredibly important. But they live in a context of the broader social world. And storytelling and Hollywood are so profoundly important to giving us a vision or multiple visions of the kinds of worlds we could live in. And so I think there's a lot of possibility to play in these kinds of conversations too. And those are eminently tied to kind of the business case for diversity.
Hey, everybody. I am Karen Tolliver. I'm VP of Animated Film at Netflix. And I have to say, thank you so much for coming. It really looks great to see such diverse people in this building. This is the first event we've actually had inviting outside people in, so it's very inspiring. And I thank everybody for putting this on. It's just an amazing event. I think when I think about the challenges, we're in a business where it's all about profit, and if you're spending millions of dollars, you don't want to really take risks. And in order to sort of bulletproof some of the creative choices we make, a lot of times, unfortunately, it's the white male from Harvard, that's the choice that feels like, okay, let's go make that choice. It's going to actually bulletproof it, our chances of success. And until we stop kind of having that bias, and I find it every day, we have to stop moving really quickly and stop ourselves and ask the question, who else could do this job? And why do we think that we're taking less risks when we're hiring someone that looks the same as we've hired every single time? And it is the risk averseness of our business that makes those choices really difficult. But the work is in the daily continuing to kind of take ourselves back to making those different choices.
So a couple themes, one thing that Diana said, one thing that Safiya said that I want to pick up on. First, I want to address the idea of, like, we've been having these discussions since 1980s, 1990s, and this is for all four of you. Based on your experiences and your studies, are there certain, because diversity is a huge catch-all, right? There's all sorts of different groups. Have we made some progress with certain underrepresented groups where you can say, you know what, we're doing a lot better now than what we were doing 20 years ago? And are there other ones, whether it's sexuality or race or class, where we're obviously still struggling? And then maybe why is that?
Well, I feel like everyone's looking at me for the study answer.
Right, yes.
Professor. So I will say that I think in the 1980s, we had kind of the first generation of people who were having a huge impact in corporate America around the United States. And we had programs and legislation that really rewarded companies for doing the right thing, like hiring people of color into their ranks and hiring women. And I think that we had a tremendous amount of representation and success that we started to see in the 1980s and the 1990s from affirmative action and other kinds of benefits of passing civil rights legislation, quite frankly. We're 2 generations now from that time, and there are words like diversity that have come to replace our common sense understanding of what it means to transform businesses and make businesses better. I mean, some of you will remember that in the 90s and the early aughts, there were so many Harvard business case studies about how diversity positively impacts the bottom line across every measure. We've kind of moved away from understanding that data and understanding that it's not just about racial and gender and kind of sexual orientation, representation and ability, different types of representation for representation's sake, but it's because those many different perspectives and worldviews and experiences are better for the bottom line. We've also moved into kind of the datafication of these conversations such that analytics and predictive analytics are having a huge impact on how we decide what the safe bets are. And of course, this is where we get into some trouble, because when we start looking at data from the past to predict what will be successful in the future, we're often using flawed data sets that represent a very narrow kind of monolithic or homogeneous worldview. And so this is one of the places where we're in the slippery slope, I think, around what executives see and how they think about what it means to bulletproof the future.
I'm sure everybody in this room has heard the term comp before. Everything needs to be built off of a comp set. If we're making a new movie or considering a new movie, what are the comps to then consider for that? Every single data model, however, is garbage in, garbage out, and homogeny in, homogeny out. If every single comp looks exactly the same, how is it ever going to tell you that something different is going to perform differently? Those things are just not, that's where the art and science of it comes in. To your question of what things have gotten better and what things do we think have still with room for improvement, I think it's fair to say that we're seeing more representation on screen. Does that apply across every single intersectionality group? The answer to that is no. But the thing where I think we still have a lot further to go is depiction, because there is still such a thing as representation while still being stereotyped. Just because someone is in a movie doesn't mean that they're in a movie in the way that the rest of the world wants to see them. So there's still issue with authenticity in representation more so than representation itself.
And can I piggyback off of that? Because the comps, that's how you get to that, because the people, if you don't have the people behind the scenes and in these rooms making these decisions, they have to go off a comp, and they can put, the person of color on there, but to the representation, they don't know what it means to see themselves. So we have to cast different. We have to have the crew, the writers, the directors, everyone doing it, so that they know what is missing in the narrative, and they know how to add that to the representation.
I think what's interesting in this is, because I also feel like I've seen, well, and I've also done the studies and actually gone in there, and I'm very passionate about data, so actually counting what are the different identities that are being represented in content. And I love the different external groups that are doing this counting too. Like I know UCLA does it, GLAAD, like all of these groups that are watching the content and saying, okay, here's who's here, here's who's missing. So I've seen those numbers go up. But what I've noticed in that is a lot of that was due to streaming. You would have these shows pop on streaming because there was, for a bit where it was really, we were spending on streaming. It was all about our content spend and having something for everybody. But now obviously the industry is kind of coming back a bit and saying, well, maybe we can get more out of less. And I think what we're going to see is that's going to turn into relying more on those proven things like IP, Obviously, we're seeing DC is coming out with how are we going to get the most out of us, Marvel, all these like established brands. And the problem is exactly that historical thing where they came out of a time where they weren't diverse, and those are the legacy characters. We have Superman, we have Batman, they are who they are. We're trying to diversify. So how do we keep the progress going when those are going to be our opportunities, is that legacy IP?
A question for you, Riaz, based on your authenticity comment. Why is it that we are still struggling with the authenticity? Is it fear? Is it data? Is it ignorance?
I think it's probably a combination of a couple of different things. Part of it is if representation is happening on screen in a particular movie or a series, there's the intent behind it. Is it to check a box, or is it to actually create an authentic story that is going to be representative of the audience that then consumes it? So part of it is the intention, again, to be authentic, or just to say that you've done something that helps check a box. I think the other part of it is, as we continue to give different voices, different people the opportunity to tell their stories, inherently that authenticity will come through. If it's the same people telling the same stories over and over again, there is a perspective there that's going to be missing. The same narrative being told over and over by the same people. Even if you're incorporating new characters, even if you're incorporating new faces, if it's all being told from the same worldview, you're going to be missing accuracy in depiction. You're going to be missing authenticity of character.
Yeah, I think someone in an earlier panel mentioned you're writing what you want to see, or versus you're writing what you think other people want to see. And I think that's exactly what we see with that representation, where when you don't have the people in the room telling their own story, you've got someone else trying to tell the story that they think is an interesting story, but that might not actually be the story that resonates with that community.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is that there are communities who sell their stories through to the larger general market. And now I'm going back into my advertising days. You know, when I used to work in advertising and earlier in my career, we used to often think about multicultural markets, especially urban and African-American markets, as kind of selling through their stories to the broader general market, because the general market followed the cultural cues and the pop cultural cues coming out of communities of color, and LGBTQ communities. And I think that there's a disconnect there too, because we are living in a society that actually loves people of color in certain types of representational forms. I don't know, Beyonce Renaissance tickets going on sale this week might be an example. And yet we have a strange disconnect about narrating that people of color or Black people are not marketable. It's so interesting, this dissonance, right? And I think there's a place to go and think about what that means, that we have a narrow worldview. I completely agree about who people of color are. And then we have all this evidence to the contrary. And we're going to have to, I think, grapple in that place.
This question's for the three Hollywood executives. Can you describe a little bit about what your own company is doing in order to push forward DEI initiatives, and also maybe what you're not doing and potentially what you should be doing? And particularly for Diana, I'm curious to hear just your experiences with what Warner Brothers Discovery has gone through in general, just because that's where you're speaking from. Obviously, if there's certain things you guys feel like you don't want to say, you don't have to. But I'm curious to hear from your own personal experiences what companies are actually doing about this right now.
I can start. I mean, for Netflix, you know, our mission is to entertain the world. And so we're really clear that there's no way to do that if you only have one perspective. It has to really reflect the people in this world and the different perspectives that they inhabit. And so we really, from a very global standpoint, are looking for local language content, and have to hire executives that really have that lived experience so that they know what is going to be of interest to that specific group. So I think in the DNA of our company, it is there. And I think the D&I efforts that are there as well are this sort of just the resource that we have to make sure that we're not having any blind spots as we go along this business. But I think we're doing a pretty good job. But it's daily work. It's the stuff that you have to keep reminding yourself on a regular basis, even if the aspiration is there, to make sure it's in the execution on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, these big companies, I mean, they're huge companies, and there's a lot of great stuff happening at all of them. But what is interesting to me is, so like the other day, I was in a room with probably about 20 freelance production people, and the question was asked, how many of you have gone through any sort of diversity training ever? And I raised my hand, and someone else who worked in DEI raised their hand, and no one else raised their hand. And I was just like, what are you talking about? This is all we did, was figuring out was giving these trainings to production people. Like, how did you not, where did that disconnect happen? And I think that's what I'm really interested in now, is because all these companies, we have these amazing, brilliant people working in these DEI teams, and they're doing really cutting edge stuff, and they're really at top of their game. But then how are we getting that to every single person at the company? Because I think all of these companies, they're doing really good stuff, but it's still in this phase of you opt in. It's not, and there is this kind of allergy to making it mandatory. I mean, we see what happened when we made sexual harassment trainings mandatory. We still had to go through a Me Too to actually get the message across, but there's got to be some way of getting it so it's not something that you opt into, and it's not the same people volunteering for DEI. It's actually permeating through the culture and hitting everyone that touches that company. I think we're getting there, though. Like, I feel like we're getting there.
So something that I can share is, it's a little bit more specific to my team and the function that my team serves within the organization. I like to think that we're in the consumer behavior business. A lot of what we do is trying as best as possible to understand people, understand the population, understand audiences, how are their needs, their tastes, their wants, their actions, their behaviors changing over time. And that applies to content. So whenever a movie, whenever a project is coming up for consideration, the first question that we ask ourselves, and we ask our department as a whole, is, who is this movie for? Who has it traditionally been for? If it's based on a property, what do we know about the property? Who has consumed it in the other forms that it has existed before? There's a lot of historical information that we can look back at with respect to who goes to certain movies, who takes on certain behaviors in their relation to certain content. Once we get to that point and we can definitively answer the question, who is this movie for? At that point, you start having discussions around, well, projects like this, we've seen evidence in the past that they significantly over-index with non-white audiences. So what should we do? Let's have a conversation about who's being casted in this movie. Let's have a conversation about from whose perspective this story is then going to be told. That's sort of the beginning and the crux of all of our discussions internally, is what do we know about our audience? How best can we continue to showcase content for them that they want? And what's the best way for us to construct every project so that it actually has an opportunity to thrive in the world that it needs to exist in?
I want to go back to something Diana said in the beginning, which was the idea of shifting diverse representation from niche content to mainstream content. And particularly sort of the really popular big budget stuff that's out there. Oftentimes those projects are greenlit by a group of very small people or one individual who ultimately makes the decision on that. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the key to getting that particular person or small group of people to understand that diverse content is business critical? It's not niche. Is it better data? Is it more diverse people working for them? Like, is there one or two things that come to mind where we can sort of cross the Rubicon in a way that we're not doing today?
I mean, pessimistically, part of me is like, well, why don't you just keep doing what you're doing and see how that works out for you? Because the consumers are also changing. I mean, there's no going back now. Like, we've gotten to see ourselves, some of us, in content, and we've gotten to taste what that feels like to actually see your story and resonate with it, and versus, you know, growing up when you would watch something and be like, oh, well, that's how TV works, but that's not how the real world is. It's different. Now we're seeing it come together. So I'm wondering if consumers are if they're going to be willing to go backwards or stay the same, or if they're going to demand more of that. And then if you have consumers doing that demand, are you going to be able to then stay in that position of greenlighting the same things over and over, or are you going to be forced to take a risk? That's really what I'm interested in, is how are they going to, because everything's changing around them. So are we going to adapt together, or what are you going to do?
Kind of piggybacking off of that from a pragmatic point of view is, I would just genuinely kick back the question of, like, how is this not already business critical? Because the population is changing. This is a fact. These trends have been happening for decades. They will continue to happen for decades. If you cut, the population of the United States, I think we're probably 60% Caucasian at this point. If you look at the younger kind of cut of that, it's already majority non-Caucasian. That trend of multiracial is just going to continue to increase even more rapidly over time. So I don't understand how you can go back to a point if the consumers that you are trying to convince to consume your content are actively changing. They're not reverting back to the way that used to be. That's just not how population trends work.
Yeah, well, and there's the global. I mean, you have global in your title too. Is we're making content for the entire world now. So how are we going to sell to the whole world?
Yeah, and I think the data only gets you so far. So I think really the answer is you have to have people in that room talking to them, because they may even kind of get it on the paper that something needs to change, but they don't know how to make it change. And that's where you get like, okay, yeah, hire a black woman as the lead, yeah, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And so we have to be there to kind of understand what it looks like creatively to kind of help us get there.
This question is for you, Karen, because it's specific to animation. I'm curious, can you push the envelope further in animation when it comes to DEI representation, or is it actually trickier in animation to do that in terms of I mean, a lot of this product is for children and so forth. I could see it going either way.
I think it depends on which envelope we're trying to push. Globally, I think the gender identity is probably a challenging global conversation to have, and those are the places we've gotten, pushback in certain regions for kids' content, and that's something we've got to keep cleverly pushing. I think there's some content that really allows you kind of to subtly fall in love with the character that doesn't have your lived experience, and it kind of, those are easier to get accepted in the tricky places versus something that's very overtly, challenging gender identity. I think the racial identity is more received kind of globally, and yes and no. There are times that they'll say that it won't really travel, but I do think we can be more strategic in our in animation content sometimes that maybe you just can't when you actually are hiring and you're looking at live action actors.
And this question's for you, Safia. Is there a role that the media can play, myself and others that cover this industry, in better highlighting these issues or demonstrating the importance of these issues? Are there certain facts we should be citing or questions we should be asking that maybe can push the ball forward?
Well, I think there are a lot of criticisms about the way media covers everything. So you're in an unenviable position, and
thank you.
I empathize. People also believe that about professors. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this conversation and the way media captures these conversations too is people are also changing, and the data doesn't, to your point, always capture the way that things should be reported on. So we have an incredibly fractured media environment now. It's not like the old days, for those of us who are from the olden days of 3 networks and PBS. We're not in that media environment anymore in any channel, newspaper, radio, television, film. So I think that presents a challenge, that people are really looking for a certain level of customization politically and culturally in terms of representation. But I don't think if you start to really look at stratifying some of the data, you'll find that people are interested in other people's stories and they relate to people differently. So if you just took a one-for-one, well, we have white men, we assume that white men want stories about white men. They want to see themselves in the media. That might be true for an older demographic. I will tell you that the students in my classroom, this is anecdotal, this is not an empirical study, but I will say that they will tell me, Professor Noble, I've grown up my whole life, and the people that I've idolized and wanted to be were people like LeBron James, right? So that's a very different kind of way that we imagine what white men want when they're 18 or 24, right? And who influences them. So those kinds of nuances, I think, are really important, and really thinking about the broader, again, taking it back to, like, what is the zeitgeist of the moment that we're in? And I think the media has played a very important role in accelerating some of the fracturing, let's say, catering to particular audiences to the extreme, quite frankly. And we see that not just in the United States, but we see things like the rise of authoritarianism around the world. We see the increasing pressures on the collapse of Western liberal democracies around the world. The media absolutely plays a role in that. And it's not just in how they cover entertainment, but what they make entertainment, including those fractures. And I think that's very important for us to think about. I mean, is the role of Hollywood to tell stories to bring people broader awareness and connection and deepen our connection to humanity and to one another? Or is it to exploit the profit margin at all costs, even if that means that hate is an incredibly profitable industry? And I study that, on the internet in my own research agenda, and I will tell you that hate and fracturing is big business. And so that's the place where I think the media has to take accountability and play a role in solving some of that.
Just to speak myself briefly, I think another thing maybe that we can do better as the business media is, I spend a lot of my time listening to these earnings conference calls where analysts speak, and certainly I speak to executives, and I'm not sure we are asking the question enough about hammering the point home of the connection between how promoting representation, both internally and externally, it is good business in a way. I hardly hear that point brought up. It's certainly almost never brought up on these earnings conference calls where analysts are talking to executives. So perhaps that is one way that, at least as reporters, we can start to ask the question if other people are not asking the question, and bringing it up and sort of highlighting the fact that there's a missed opportunity here from a business case. Thanks.
I think that'd be great, because I've listened to those earnings calls too, and I was always surprised that absolutely no one is bringing up representation on those calls. But that's the best chance to do it. If you did, then like CFOs and CEOs, they would have to start actually preparing their response, which I don't think they're asked to enough. I think part of having a really best-in-class DEI team is that you don't necessarily have to speak. You can have somebody else do it. And so you can really hold them to task.
And let me add, I think we can hold up successes also as failures. For example, anyone here whose child, like mine, was waiting for a year for Black Panther to come out. I have an 11-year-old, and the trailer to Black Panther played every day in our house for a year. And then going to Disneyland, and there's no Black Panther merchandise, right? And it took for a year. And the last time we went, there was like 2 things offered. So while we have a huge success like Black Panther, where it touches kids, for example, and they can't get a Black Panther hoodie anywhere or anything and show the pride, those things, are also failures. So I think we have a lot of learning that we can do around different projects too.
And that couldn't have happened if, we were in the room when they're building the consumer products campaign. We would have been like, known. "Are you
We'd
kidding?
Have been like, sis,
our cousins
get it here."
Yeah,
absolutely, all the way. I need a 2XL. Absolutely.
A couple questions. One, you brought up Black Panther, which is a great example. I heard in the previous panel someone mention bros, which is sort of the quintessential recent example of a representation movie that didn't do well in the box office. And I'm curious, from your perspectives, how you make sure that executives don't point to that example as the reason why they shouldn't be trying for big box office movies that are clearly geared toward representing a class that has been underrepresented.
Well, this is where the data is just so biased. It's like how many, heterosexual romantic comedies have failed between now and, November, and nobody's really thinking about, we're not doing those anymore, So the pressure on any one thing in a new category to be successful is just, it's not fair.
But will that be a winning argument?
No, it won't. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. And that's why it's like you're kind of in the battleground, kind of fighting it case by case. And until it sort of gets the watershed moment where, okay, finally we have, even if you have one success, they're going to go, well, there only was one. Look at the other. Look at Bros. That didn't work, And again, it's the risk-averse part of our business that's going to make that challenging. And I do think the data of going, yeah, but look at our audience. Look at how diverse our audience is. They really want it. It's going to be an uphill battle, definitely.
I also think there's probably somewhat of an unfair expectation put on movies like that. Just because a movie has a narrative that has LGBTQIA representation doesn't mean that every single person who fits into that group is then going to go watch that movie. No single intersectional group, we've said this before today, is a monolith. So why would there be an expectation that every single person in that group is going to go support that movie? There could be plenty of people who just don't enjoy the genre. There could be plenty of people who don't know who the stars in the movie are, and so they don't have there's not a marketability hook for them. So to put that kind of pressure on a single project, I think is incredibly unfair. A test or an experiment with one sample is not a test or an experiment. And it's not fair for anyone to really put that type of pressure on any one sample.
We're living through an obvious change in how people consume content. And I'm curious from your perspectives, in a much more fractured media environment now from what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And as, generally speaking, theater attendance goes down. Does a streaming world allow for a better overall representation, or to Diana's earlier point, is the fear that in a streaming world you can kind of get away with saying we're doing DEI efforts, look at this and this and this and this, but they're all TV series or movies that end up only getting watched by a niche audience, and therefore sort of the message becomes diluted?
That's a spicy one. I think when I had been afraid that the content that could have been theatrical was going to go that way, because that would mean that theatrical business could not take the risks, to make these big movies. Here's what I think now. Streaming is so competitive that we want to win at all levels. And so you have to make a piece of content that is going to have impact, whether it's in theatrical or whether it's streaming. It's sort of the competition is the same. And so I think if people had thought, okay, we're going to just make this little thing and it'll be fine, and, I think we now realize that everything really has to be great, for us to really pay attention to it. So I do think that was the initial concern, but I do now think that people understand that we really have to make great content wherever we make it.
I think there's also more we should I've been saying this for a while, that we really need to be looking at these algorithms and how they're working for us, because I remember having a conversation with a Black colleague who was saying, oh my goodness, this weekend I had the most magnificent weekend of all Black content. Like, there's so much great Black content out right now and it's all getting put on my front page. And I was like, I didn't see any of that on my front page. I think they just figured out who you are, and you're getting a different experience than I'm getting. And he was like, oh, well, now I'm depressed. And I see it and I don't think it's malicious. I think we just get very excited about personalizing and coding these algorithms that will give you exactly what you want, and that'll keep you in there. But I think that, similar to what's Hollywood's responsibility, is it to get that money, which I think right now we kind of maybe feel like it is because we're in survival mode, but really it should be
So just to piggyback on that, so are you arguing that part of the solution is actually to depersonalize the algorithm?
I know. Because, and I think people are, maybe I'm just starting to talk about this too a lot, but like, I'm not getting served, I don't know that I'm getting served more of what I like, and it is kind of starting to get a little frustrating. I think Spotify is like the biggest example of like, I don't think I hear a lot of new music that I haven't heard before, but it's all kind of the same, and it's all kind of sounds like, oh yeah, I like this, and I'm not hearing anything that's challenging me. And so how do I know? I feel like I'm kind of falling into like, this is the music I like, and I'll never hear anything different ever again unless I like really go out there, but how am I gonna find it? Because it's not even showing up on my page at all. Like,
yeah, I agree.
A little existential now.
Yeah, I think, online libraries, let's say, there's another way we could think of the content that gets, organized at Netflix or anywhere else, has changed all kinds of media and information and knowledge consumption. In the old days, I love to talk about the old days because they're really like the 70s or the 80s, and that's not really that long ago. But there was a time when we had different experiences of, we call it kind of serendipity, where you just stumbled upon things. In a library context, we talked about it as like walking up and down the stacks or going to different floors. And you'd be so amazed and seeing the relationship between one thing. You thought you were going for one thing, and then you found all these other things, and then you walked out with 10 things, And so these are the limits of the kind of the digital structures that we have come to interface with now that really limit our ability for that kind of serendipity, for that kind of just stumbling upon things, because there's such a desire by so many companies to be precise and predictive and anticipate who you are. And one of the things that does is it relates to people based on their past. All your past choices, never a sense of the future you that could become from your exposures to new things. So we need to reimagine interfaces. We need to reimagine design. We need to reimagine how we create this kind of, these possibilities for, new imaginaries or new versions of ourselves. And we really don't. The industry is really, and this is tech writ large, has such a narrow imagination about these kinds of things, and I think there's a ton of possibility there too.
I also think that the opportunity in the way we make content is diversifying the way the content is thought of. So like if you think about preschool programming, it's like there's a boys aisle and there's a girls aisle. And I think there's, we think about there's a black movie and it's a Latin movie or it's a LGBTQ movie. And how do you sort of really just tell a movie, tell content that really sort of invites everyone in, so I think there's opportunities there without us sort of thinking about it in such, unique categories,
All right, I was saving this question for the end, but in addition to the changes in distribution, we are also living through a current moment now where the major media companies, by and large, are all fairly drastically cutting costs. We've already seen it at Warner Brothers Discovery. Disney just announced it, $5 billion. They laid off 7,000 people or are planning on laying off 7,000 people. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it from even more from the other major media companies. How can we, on this stage and also in the audience, make sure that DEI is not cut in those cost-cutting efforts?
I think part of that is we go back to this topic of risk aversion, right? What do studios consider to be risk-averse content? I'll take a step back from this and talk to all of us in this room as consumers. Continue supporting the content that you really love. Go to the theater, press the button on streaming. If there's a particular type of content or a particular story that you like, amplify it, watch it, make other people aware of it. And again, we're all responsible for listening and adapting to changing consumer behavior. Help us hear you, help us hear each other, because we're making business decisions based off of consumer behavior. The more that we have to learn from everybody in this room and all of our peers who consume content alongside us, I think it helps us continue to have that discussion internally around what really is a risk versus what isn't a risk, and what deserves to be considered a risk versus what doesn't.
Yeah, I think, definitely we're all consumers before we're employees. I think also, I mean, there's no going back, first off. We got a lot done because, for a bit there, we had these enormous teams and we did get a lot done and we got a lot started. And I think first we have to trust that the things that we got started will continue, and if they're starting to fall by the wayside, I think we all have a responsibility to put the pressure on to keep those going. Because at a certain point, ideally soon, but who knows when, at a certain point with DEI, we're embedding DEI into the systems that are happening. So ideally, it should be every single employee's responsibility to be upholding this. And we have these separate DEI teams just to take on the load of getting those going and ensuring that they're happening and getting it moving. But, I think ideally, in our ideal society, that wouldn't be a separate team's job. That would be each individual person. So I think we can all be taking that on ourselves and being allies, not just to our own communities, but to other communities, and putting that pressure on in the work that we do.
I'm going to say the least popular thing, so I'm glad I'm not going last. I think we need to think of ourselves and remember ourselves as workers. At a time where we have companies making record profits, especially tech companies, which I consider media industries broadly tech companies, record profits. And where those profits come from are in workers being laid off, workers' wages being suppressed. It's really important that we think about this. And I just came out of, the University of California just came through a major strike with our grad students and our workers. So we are in an industry of higher education where we understand worker power and that you can actually change a lot of things by refusing your work. And, I know that this is a radical idea for Hollywood, but it really shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that we think that we are available for layoffs or for cutting all these kinds of important programs while companies post record profits. I just think the immorality of that has to be brought to the forefront. We have to talk about these in moral terms. What does it mean to live in a place like LA where companies are bringing in billions of dollars and more people can't afford the rent? And we have a lot of power to influence those conversations and make those part of the earnings calls and talk about, our kind of ESG commitments and DEI commitments inside of those types of decisions. These are about shareholders and the C-suite and their decisions that impact many people. And so I implore us to, again, pull ourselves back out of just thinking of ourselves as employees and consumers, but thinking about ourselves as voters, as workers, as neighbors, as people who are trying to reimagine this city and reimagine the industry's role in this city.
I can't follow that. No, I think you're right in that there is the profitability and there's the drain of folding into those kinds of choices. But I think you're right. It's how do we sort of make space for being human in these jobs? And I do think the right choice is the diverse choice because it will make us stand out in a way. And even if the data doesn't feel that way, or even if we're trying to get risk averse, to use our voice, I use my power every day for those of you that are hiring managers. But even if you're not, to really kind of remind us of those things, I think, I just +1 on what you said. Thanks.
Well, thank you guys for doing this. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Certainly learned